Well, you guys are blessed to have a pastor like that, and boy, was it nice listening to the rehearsal with that music. I tell you what, a lot of churches don't have music like that. And Jay Seegert, he was one of the best. He's probably the most gracious. That's probably one of the most gracious creation speakers out there. I mean, even the atheists like him, you know, and they go out to lunch, and he's so gracious, and I don't know how he does it, but that's something I got to work on. And and so you don't have Jay, but you're going to get a talk this morning that I've never heard him talk about. It's called the Hydroplate theory. But first, before we get into that, I need to apologize to Iowa. I'm so sorry. Whoops. Yeah, I'm so sorry. You know, you got those Iowa, Minnesota jokes. And yeah, you guys probably have a bunch of Minnesota jokes, but I remember the one that when I was a kid, it's like, what would happen if the Minnesota gave the lower tier counties to Iowa? The answer was the IQ would go up in both states. But that is so far wrong. That is so wrong. I just have to say, hey, we got Tim Walz and we got tampons in the bathrooms, so we can't take the high ground there anymore. And the other thing that's happening too is they're trying to get HF 3239, where they want to force all students in Minnesota to get the MMR vaccine. Even the homeschoolers, they're taking away the exemption. Where here in Iowa, you guys have you're taking the other path. The schools have to tell the parents about the exemptions. You know, it's like you parents are smart enough, get all the information, make your own choice. Where in Minnesota, that's not the case. So I'm here to tell you, don't let Minnesota come to Iowa. You know, you guys are doing a good job. Keep fighting for your freedom. You're way ahead of us. And so in that respect, that joke is not accurate. So yeah, I got that off my chest now. I don't have to give an account for those words. But speaking of health, yeah, I'm going to be at the Reclaim Your Health conference. It's going to be in Ankeny. It's Saturday, November 22nd. So if you know any churches or schools that want a creationist to speak, I'll be in the area. And I might have a table at Faith, I'm not sure. But yeah, so that's coming down because we need all the information to make informed decisions. And what I think you're really going to enjoy is this, let's see, October 12th. This video is premiering. It's called An Inconvenient Study. They finally did a study between the vaxxed and the unvaxxed, and it turns out, and they had it completed 5 years ago, but they don't release it because the vaxxed are clearly healthier. And so this video, it's going to drop on Monday, and the people who did this study, I think it was Henry Ford Health, they sent them a cease and desist letter saying, we're going to sue you for defamation if you release it. And so, but Dell had everything on hidden camera, so it's like, I'm saying the truth here. And so, yeah, you can go check that out. It's going to be October 12th. You go into aninconvenientstudy.com, and then you'll be able to see that. And then, speaking of health, I love being at booths during the county fair because I get to talk to people I never talk to. And this guy comes up to me and he clearly knows me, but I don't have a clue who he is. And I said, what's your name? And he says, Mike, and he tells me the last name. Oh yeah, I remember you a lot bigger. He goes, yeah, I lost 50 pounds. And he says, and I'm not a diabetic anymore. And I said, well, how'd you do that? And he said, I stopped eating all meats, anything meat product, all animal products. That's butter, that's eggs, that's everything. He said he was a diabetic for 10 or 12 years, and he also recommended this book, Reversing Diabetes by Dr. Neil Barnard, B-A-R-N-A-R-D, Barnard. But yeah, he recommended this book, and it's just amazing. I don't know why I brought it, but maybe that'll be helpful for somebody. All right, okay. So let's jump into this hydroplate theory. Has anybody ever heard about the hydroplate? Nobody has heard about the hydroplate. Oh, this guy, Pastor Dwayne did. All right. Yeah, I believe that this theory will destroy the Big Bang when it gets into the mainstream, because it makes accurate predictions, and also NASA discoveries are validating it. And so I'll just show you a clip here. Hopefully the sound will work. And yeah, I was interviewed on Real Science Radio, and he wanted to show this clip and to get our expression, but it wasn't working. And so just plug it in later, just edit it in. He goes, no, I want your expressions. And I want you to keep your eye on the bottom right corner. That's Doug. And listen, watch his expressions.
So let me know what you think. This is the most insane space news in a really long time. This asteroid, called Bennu, is 63 million kilometers away. That's 160 times farther than the moon is. Over the last few years, this spacecraft called OSIRIS-REx traveled all the way there, touched its surface, grabbed a sample, and brought it all the way back to Earth. And what they found in that sample is insane. It's rich in carbon, nitrogen, and organic compounds, all of which are essential to life as we know it, but we've seen that before. The asteroid is also covered in a mineral called serpentine, which looks like this. And these samples look just like the type of rock that we find here in mid-ocean ridges. This is where the stuff from the mantle of the Earth comes up and touches the water. It's underwater. Scientists think that this asteroid could be a chunk of an ancient small ocean world. This could be a piece of an old watery planet that's been traveling through space for billions of years, and we just took a sample of it.
Wow.
What do you think of that?
Wow. Oh my goodness.
We have a few minor tweaks for, first of all, that watery planet, let's call it Earth,
Oh,
as
yeah.
Kevin Lee likes to say. I wanted to get your reaction, Brian, because when I saw that, I'm like, wow. She works for Walt Brown and Real Science Radio in creating a short for us without us having to do all that production effort.
Yeah, she needs a raise, I think. Man.
Well, what everyone just saw on display was an example of a victim of the government schools, a victim of the deceptions and the errors that Brian has uncovered. That girl, to not even consider that this giant water planet is Earth, but that it's been traveling through space for millions of years, is because she has been victimized by exactly what Brian's been uncovering. And it's actually sad. It's sad to see, but it is instructive as to the work we have to do.
Yeah, and then the heart beats, and eventually your heart's going to stop. And that's why I do this. Where are you going when your heart stops? I want you to think about eternity. But that's Real Science Radio. You're going to see that website on here, rsr.org. This can be a bookmark in your Bible, and it can be part of your devotionals. They're really good websites. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, it's, why are they so excited about this discovery? And in half an hour, you're going to understand why it's so exciting. And this hydroplate theory, it's a great witnessing tool. This guy says there are a few things in life that have ever excited me as the topic of the hydroplate theory. And yeah, it's like having the answers to the exam. Whenever they find something new, it's like, yeah, hydroplate explains that. We're not surprised at all. We're there shocked all the time. And then I got this email, and it said, I've been praying that God would send intelligent Christian clients who would talk to him, because I've been praying for him. Brian, you were an answer to prayer. Your conversation with Dan has opened his mind. I believe that he's been watching your videos a bit because he shared one with me. And I got a couple hundred videos out there. It's like, boy, that's nice to hear, but which video did he share with you? I got dinosaurs, Noah's Ark, all this stuff. And it was the hydroplate. And this was the hydroplate overview. I had 15 or 20 minutes to speak to the Rotary Club, and I did this topic, trying to squeeze it in there. And it was during COVID, so the doors were open in the restaurants. There's all this background noise. And I tried to edit out the noise, and it was just horrible. It's probably the second worst video sound-wise. And yet, it's not so much the quality of the video, it's the content. So this hydroplate, he thought it made a lot of sense. And I was going to go to St. Louis and talk to the creation scientists. They were having a convention there this summer, and somebody said, nah, don't waste your time. Their minds are made up. He said, go to the homeschoolers. So I went to Duluth in Minnesota and had a booth. I spoke here at the Iowa Homeschool Convention and had some great conversations. And up here in Duluth, you can't see the sign, but it says, will the hydroplate theory destroy the Big Bang? And everybody comes up and, what's the hydroplate? So it takes 10 or 15 minutes to explain it. And I almost lost my voice for speaking the next day at church. But there's all these unexpected things. Now, these are just screenshots of scientific journals and articles from atheist perspectives. They want to know why, unexpected, fossil oddity, long-standing puzzle, scientists puzzled, surprising features, world is surprised. It just goes on and on. They're always surprised because their perspective of the past is wrong. It's a blind chance perspective. It's like, it's not science versus religion. It's blind chance versus creation. This building didn't get put together by chance, right? Say, who helped remodel this building? It is just beautiful. Oh, praise the Lord. You know, you did an excellent job. I walked into the bathroom, it's just like, wow, this is first class. You know, it's very nice. And definitely don't judge a book by the cover here. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, this did it get put together by chance? No, there's a little thought. Yeah, there were skilled people who did it. I helped on a building project by Chicago, and I get there, and I'm new, and I don't know anybody really, and I get there, and they needed this stuff moved so the big lift, the jack could drive around. So I went and I picked up this suitcase thing, and I picked it up, and it wasn't shut. Everything just spilled out all over the place, and then it kind of went downhill from there. So I found out that my skill with a building project is garbage to the dumpster. I can do that. I can do garbage to the dumpster. And so, but thank you that you've got the skills. And I think those are the skills for young people. Get involved in a building project. Those are helpful skills. I wish I would have done that when I was younger. But again, this hydroplate theory, it answers all these 25 major features on Earth and in the solar system, and it answers them. You know, and this is it. This is the 9th edition of the hydroplate theory, and it's got, 600 pages. And so this is it. It's all-encompassing, and it's got thousands of scientific references to it, but yet it's still, you know, it's understandable. You can go Walt Brown surfing. And Walt Brown, a little bit about his background, he was a West Point grad, Army Ranger, paratrooper, got his PhD from MIT. And when he applied there, he was in the 99th percentile, so he's just brilliant. And then he ran the Benet Military Lab, where he had dozens of PhDs working for him. And he also taught at the U.S. Air Force Academy. And just a brilliant guy, just brilliant, full colonel. But he came up and he was an atheist, or an evolutionist, I should say. And he's driving through Kansas. I thought it was South Dakota, but it's Kansas. I read his biography online, and you can hear it. You know, his biography, I read it. He was on Christian Men of Science, 11 Men Who Changed the World. And he's one of them. And it's up there with the Maxwell and all these other guys. But he's going through Kansas, and he hears on the radio that somebody claimed they found an ark on a mountain. And he thought, wow, that's crazy. You know, how could that happen? But he took down the radio source and got in contact with the guy. And the guy would stay at his house sometimes, and they'd talk about it. You know, where'd all the water come from? I mean, you mountains, up rock. You know, how does that ark get up there? You know, where'd all the water come from? And the guy said, maybe outer space. It's like, okay, but then where did it go? You know, he's just puzzled with that. And then he thought, you know, if there was an ark on the mountain, that would mean the whole world was underwater. That'd mean there's a whole bunch of plants and animals that got buried in fossils, or got buried in mud and turned into fossils. So if fossils are actually evidence for a flood, what's the evidence for evolution? And he started asking all his PhD scientists, and they didn't have any. And then he looks in the Bible, and this is a Bible-based theory, not like catastrophic plate tectonics, which what most creation organizations push or promote. That's just a secular model, plate tectonics sped up. And I think we should start with the Bible. And that's what he finds in Psalm 136. It says, to him that stretched out the earth above the waters. Earth above the waters. And then Psalm 133, he gathered the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the depth in storehouses. Oh, interesting. And the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up. And as thou entered into the springs of the sea. So clearly there was water inside the earth. And so he just took that theory. And I gave this book, actually it was the 8th edition, and I gave it to a professor at St. Cloud State. And she wanted to see it because I said, you don't have a theory for Grand Canyon that works. And she knows that. You know, my brother-in-law, he took a geology class there decades ago, and they looked at all the theories for Grand Canyon. None of them worked. And then Friday comes, he says, guys, you know, the professor says, we looked at all these theories. None of them work. There's a theory, but there's a theory we haven't looked at. Anybody know what it is? Kid says, yeah, Noah's flood. And the teacher says, you're right, but we can't talk about it. So they don't have a theory, and that wasn't right after the flood, but for Grand Canyon, and that's reasons for that, but they won't look at it because it comes from the Bible. And so I gave it to her. She had it for about 6 months. We got back together, and we talked about it for about 1.5 years. And she says, if the assumption is true, the science works. I just don't believe the assumption was true, that there's water inside the earth. It's like, why not? There's water inside the earth today. That's what those deep smoke, or those black smokers are. There's water coming up inside the ocean. And so that's the assumption. So the big one assumption is half of the ocean at least was inside the Earth at one time. So just think of the Earth as a big apple. The crust is, he says 60, but it's probably more like 30. You know, he made it based on the assumptions that asteroids and trans-Neptune objects were solid, but they're not. They're like boulders, so they're a lot less dense, so we wouldn't need 60 miles thick. So it could be 30 to 60, whatever, but in the book it says 60. So just think of the Earth as an apple. The crust of the apple is 60 miles thick, made of granite. And then there's a layer of water about a mile thick, and then underneath that is the mantle. That's the one assumption. See, most theories, they go for what we know, the effect, and try and figure out what caused it. And we don't know that. This is different. He's setting up the cause with one assumption, lets the laws of physics go at it, and explains everything. So let's let the laws of physics start going. You throw the moon in there. Now that's going to tug on the Earth twice a day. And the crust wasn't broken into plates like it is today. It was just the crust. So now at twice a day, it's stretch and compress, stretch and compress, stretch and compress. And that's like if I had a wire up here, bend it back and forth, it gets hot. Stretch and compress, crust gets hot, heat goes into the water. Water gets hotter and hotter and hotter. It wants to boil, but it can't because there's no room to expand. And then at 705 degrees and 3,200 pounds per square inch, it becomes supercritical water, where it's not really water and it's not really steam, but whatever it is, it dissolves things like crazy. And so it's dissolving the granite above and the mantle below, and it's mixing it together and making, you know, limestone and chalk and quartz and calcium carbonate and all these cementing agents and salts. And that's where we get the limestone. You know, when limestone forms, it releases some carbon dioxide, and there's 60,000 times more limestone on the surface of the Earth than carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so then, Walt Brown, you know, he's taking classes, geology classes at Arizona State from Bob Dietz. And he's the guy who coined the term seafloor spreading. And they'd get together every Wednesday and they'd talk for an hour or so about things. And so he's getting a really good education on geology, and people scoff at him because he's not a geologist. But he has sat at the feet of one of the world's experts on plate tectonics. And he said, "Hey Bob, where did all the limestone come from?" And Bob says, "Beats the blank out of me." But this explains where the limestone came from and how it didn't poison the atmosphere. It just kept on getting recycled. And so that's the cementing agent. And then these are the phases of the hydroplate theory. First, it's the rupture phase. We'll get to that. And then it's the flood phase. And then it's the continental drift phase, which is only about a day. And then there's the compression event where the mountains rise up in about an hour. And then there's the recovery phase, which we're in right now. Okay, so what's happening? You got the supercritical water dissolving the crust above and the mantle below, and the crust is getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and that's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and it's getting more and more pressure. Walt Brown says 372,000 psi in that water. I mean, if this was a water bottle and it was 372,000 psi, and I just cracked it, it'd probably blow up this room. You know, it's tremendous pressure. Okay. And so then it's getting weaker and weaker and weaker, and finally the crust cracks, and then that crack goes in two directions all the way around the Earth and comes together like a seam on a baseball. And I think that's what happened on the 600th day of Noah's life. In the 17th month, the second day, the fountains of the great deep were broken up. And I think that's what happened. And you say, well, come on, and then it could rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The water's just shooting up for 40 days, 40 nights. And you say, well, come on, if that would have happened, wouldn't it leave a mark? And it's, yeah, it did. It's the mid-oceanic ridge. There's a 46,000 mile mountain range that goes around the bottom of every ocean and then comes together. And he thinks that's where it ended, at that T. Where it came together, there was a T, and then the pressure stopped. So you run the movie backwards, he thinks it started up by Alaska. And then it comes together. Boom. Okay, that's the rupture phase. And now we're going to go to the flood phase, where the water's coming up and up and up. You know, because it's, you know, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, but yet the water kept rising until the 150th day. So what happened then, because the water, like if you had a water sprinkler in a barrel, it's going to be spraying out until the water gets high enough, and then it's not going to spray out anymore. So I think that's what happened. But that's where we get our sedimentary rock, because it's eroding the granite above on the sides and on the bottoms of it, and also the basalt below. And when you find sedimentary rock that doesn't have carbon in it, like limestone, it's 65 parts granite and 35 parts basalt. And I think that's because the granite was getting eroded on two sides instead of just one side. And now you got two 60-mile cliffs crumbling into this hypersonic water coming up. And on Earth, you can only have a cliff that's 5 miles high. Otherwise, it crushes it. So this is crumbling in there. That's where we get our sedimentary rock. And then it's evenly mixed with the chemicals that are in the water. And then Science Daily says, Earth's crust is missing in the mid-Atlantic. Why is it missing in the mid-Atlantic? Was the crust never there? If it was then there but torn away? If so, then how and why? Well, this is why. Because this is the continental drift phase. Because those two cliffs get wider and wider and wider, and pretty soon there's nothing pushing down on the mantle, and the mantle bulges. And then the continents start to slide. You got North America and South America sliding to the west, and Europe and Africa sliding to the east. And this says, imagine how fast a skater or a hydroplate would slide down a mountainside the size of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and whose surface was 50 times slicker than liquid water. Hydroplate, it's like, it's you know, like when you play air hockey, if you put water on there, it's not going to slide real well. But if it's floating on air, it's going all over the place. And I think that's what the hydroplates, or the plates were. They were on this supercritical water, so there's no friction, and they start sliding. And then again, North America, South America sliding west, Africa and Europe sliding east, and they keep going until they meet resistance. And then they buckle up and the mountains form. And that's why the mid-oceanic ridge or the mountain ranges are pretty much parallel to the mid-oceanic ridge. Okay? So you can see, and then you can see how the Rockies are twice as wide as the Andes. The Rockies in North America, and I think it's because North America slid over the mid-oceanic ridge right there. Okay, so that's the continental slide. And that takes about a day. And then the compression event, that's about an hour. The mountains form in about an hour. It's like this big car wreck. You know, like when you get in a car accident, the bent up hood, that just didn't happen slowly over millions of years. It was boom, that was it. And now it's bent, and you can see the effect of that. And it says the continental drift phase ended with the compression event, the sudden crushing, buckling, and thickening of crashing hydroplates. Earth's mountains, such as the Andes, were pushed up in less than an hour, is what a PhD from MIT says, with mechanical engineering. And then this is Psalm 104. The waters stood above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the voice of thy thunders they hasted away. Can you imagine what it sounded like when the mountains were formed? And then the compression event, okay? The mountains, they're sliding, they meet resistance, incredible friction turns the granite into magma and basalt into magma. And then it also has a lot of pressure, and that's where we get the coal and oil and metamorphic rocks such as marble and diamonds. And they all have carbon-14 in them, so they can't be millions of years old. And this is the Gunnison River, the Black Canyon, I think it is. And that's, for scale there on top, those are 15-foot trees on top of that. So what kind of force could crush granite? Those are compression crushes. You know, essentially if it was getting spread apart, it'd just be straight. Rock's really tough in compression. And those, it's like a marble cake. And that's what they have underneath Grand Canyon. And so what force would do that? The hydroplate explains it perfectly. So the plates are sliding, and then they meet resistance, and then they buckle up. And yet there's sedimentary rock that's sliding too. And as it buckles up, the sedimentary rock keeps sliding. And that's why you have slanted layers underneath flat layers at the Grand Canyon. What kind of force would do that? And then this one that's really hard, this quartzite block, sandstone under pressure, turns into quartzite, I believe. And so it gets lifted up in this mud, and there it is. It's a 5 to 10 ton rock that's way up there, and it got formed, you know, from the rock below. It got lifted up there. How does that get lifted up over millions of years? That's a real tough question. And they don't, I went to Grand Canyon this year. That wasn't in any of the placards. They don't talk about that, because that really destroys their millions of years. And then we get to the recovery phase. Okay, this is day 151. The mountains form up. Okay, so what's going to happen? The mountains, right, well, how does a plateau form? That's a mystery, major mystery for them. But the mountains are a big mass on a small base. They sink in. If something sinks in, something has to rise up. And that's how the plateau is formed. The force is gravity, and the mechanism is hydraulic lifting. you got this big mountain going squirting magma out to the side, and then it's going to block fault up the plateau and the weak points. And that's how you get the plateaus around most of every, the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas, which is like 3 miles high, Colorado Plateau by the Rockies, which is like 1 mile high. And so then it block faults up, some of the lava squirts to the top at times, and it protects it. Anybody ever been to Grand Canyon? Any? Okay, yeah. Before they cut that big hole, there was another 1,000 feet of sediment all over that area. That had to get eroded first. That's called the Great Denudation, and that's when two huge lakes drained. This is maybe 100 or 200 years after the flood, because the rock had to get solid so it wouldn't sloop in. And so the lake's draining, and a whole bunch of water comes shooting by, and it doesn't wash away the lava on top. It goes around it, and that's Red Butte. It's 1,000 feet of Mesozoic sediment, which is really soft, capped with volcanic rock. And I got to see that on the bus trip going right by there. There it is. And there's Red Butte. If you go up from Phoenix, it's going to be on your right. And then if you go out on the west or the east end of Grand Canyon, there's Cedar Mountain. You know, so there's Red Butte and there's Cedar Mountain. And Cedar Mountain's smaller than Red Butte the way it looks. But you go there and you can see that from the lookout tower. And there it is, you know, that 1,000 feet of sediment that got washed away. And it was interesting because that tower, it had windows pointing out, but the window that faced this thing had a big blanket over it. And I wish I would have taken a picture. But yeah, I was out there because there was a videographer from California. He wants to do a documentary on the Hydroplate. And so we got some footage from the Grand Canyon. And if anybody ever tries to tell you how that little river cut that big canyon, ask them. Oh, those are questions. We don't have time to get into it right now. And that's a whole nother talk. And I was supposed to debate somebody on this, the origin of Grand Canyon, but 3 days before the event, he had personal issues and couldn't do it. And that was months and months ago, and his personal issues must still be going on because he still hasn't stepped up to the microphone. Okay, now, actually somebody else might be, but he's looking at it, we'll see. And the Walt Brown book, at the end of every chapter, he's got these decision tables. He's got all the theories on top and all the features on the side, and it's red explains it. Red is no, and yellow is maybe. And you look under the hydroplate theory, and it's green all the way down for Grand Canyon. You look at all the other ones that maybe have 1 or 2 green, and it's mainly red and yellow. And the professors know this. You know, you go into their website, they got 4 theories, none of them work. I keep submitting mine, and or the hydroplate, and they tend to ignore it. Okay, so the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Okay, so the mountains sink in, the plateaus rise up. Okay, now the Mid-Oceanic Ridge rises up. That means something has to sink in. Well, what's going to sink in? It's the Pacific Ocean. 151 days after the flood, that sinks in. That's the Ring of Fire. That's why the trenches, Mariana Trench, 6 miles deep, is in the Pacific. I mean, that's deeper than Mount Everest is high. How does that happen? The trenches are mainly there, a lot more seamounts, and volcanoes are there. And you know, that could be the climate thing. If you got more volcanoes active, that could change the climate. And then, and the Pacific is just so much different than all the other oceans. They even had a continent sink in. You know, we had 8 continents. It was Zealandia, eighth continent, reveals buried secret. Found evidence that land-based fossils. So at one time, that was above the surface of the Earth, and then it sunk in and got buried in water. And then he also does a decision tree for the hydroplate theory, comparing it to the plate tectonics, and it's clearly the hydroplate. We need to get this into the mainstream. We need to get this into creation museums, and we're trying like crazy to do that. You know, it'll be interesting to see which creation museum is the first one or the second one to get it into their museum. You know, Brian Young from the Creation Instruction Association, he's got a museum in Broken Bow, Nebraska. It's called Boneyards, and he's got the hydroplate in there. So yeah, that's the first museum to do it. Let's see which other museums do it. Okay, so then the water, you know, the Pacific sinks in, and the water that was covering the Earth gushes off the Earth to fill in the Pacific Ocean, and it cuts these submarine canyons. They're deeper than Grand Canyon, longer than Great Canyon, but they're underneath a whole bunch of water right now, and that can't happen today. So the continental shelves were higher. The continents sunk in, the oceans rose up and buried those submarine canyons. And you got a canyon, you know, in Greenland, underneath 2 kilometers of ice. How does that happen? Well, the water rushed off Greenland, cut the canyon, and then the Ice Age came and filled it up. And they don't have a theory for the ice age either. They got 40 of them, which means none of them work. And once it starts, why would it stop? And this is nature, says perhaps the longest standing puzzle in Earth science is what caused the northern hemisphere ice sheets to come and go. Well, we know, because to have an ice age, you need warmer oceans so you get more precipitation, but yet you need cooler summers, continents, so the snow doesn't melt. See, an ice age, it just melts more than snows more than it melts year after year after year. Okay, and that's what the ocean, with all those volcanoes, you got warmer oceans, comes down, well, how come the continents were cooler? They were higher, therefore cooler, plus a lot more aerosols from the volcanoes are in the atmosphere, so the sun's heat doesn't get through. So 400 or 500 years for the ice age to form, and 100 years for it to melt. But notice up in Alaska and Siberia, no glacier during the ice age, in the upper right corner there. How in the world does that happen? It's because it was closer to the water, and it came down as rain instead of snow. And then the same story goes in Antarctica. They got a whole bunch of lakes. And then there's this frozen mammoth, frozen standing up. How does that happen? With identifiable food in its stomach. Okay, how did it get so cold so fast in late summer? That's cold hail. Some of the stuff went up with such tremendous force that it got out of our atmosphere and got super cold in outer space, and then Earth's gravity pulled it back down and buried the mammoths, flash froze them. Okay, and so then, why didn't they thaw out? That brings us to the big roll. If you have the Himalayas, that's the red dot up there. Okay, the Himalayas, if you got a big mass on a spinning object, the big mass is going to try to get to the side. Therefore, it's taking something on the top to the side and something on the side to the top. And that's what I think happened with the mammoths. You got Mammothville, where there's a lot of food and water, because mammoths can't live where there's no food and water. They can't live up in the Arctic. And then there was the big roll, Himalayas formed, and now you got Mammoth Chill, where they never thawed out. And the same thing, you got Axel Island up there, and above the the Arctic Circle, snakes, tortoises, alligators, badgers, shrews, redwoods, they can't grow up there in the darkness. And so it got rolled up there. And similarly, South Pole is mostly covered by ice, but fossils show that crocodiles, dinosaurs, and palm trees once lived there. Well, that's because just like on something to the top went to the side, something on the bottom went to the side, so the side went to the bottom. So Antarctica got pushed down where that happened. Pushed down to the bottom. And it's like, well, if that happened, wouldn't it leave a mark? Yeah, it did. It's called the 90 East Ridge. There's a crack on Earth that's almost perfectly straight. That's very odd. And it's pointed directly at the Himalayas. And that's because the Earth isn't perfectly round. It's got a bulge at the equator, and when the Earth rolled through that bulge, it cracked it there. So I think that the Himalayas, they were formed 3,000 miles farther north than where they're at now. And then you got the inland seas. They got all this salt at the bottom of all these salt plumes, and we'll get to that. And also chondrules. You guys never heard of chondrules, so let's see what those are. Small rounded particles embedded in mostly stony meteorites, formed in high temperatures. Well, that explains it. And they were melted somehow, it's not understood, and they had high velocity collisions and quickly cooled. It's really hot, really hard collisions, and then quickly cooled. Okay, well, when the plates are going up and down, they're going to flutter. It's going to build up pressure at one end, and the pressure is going to go up, and then it's going to go up, and then it's going to shoot out, but the granite is going to flutter. It's going to slam down, high velocity collision, which is what they need. Boom, the granite's hitting the mantle, making these chondrules, and then they get shot to the end, and they wait for the pressure to be built up, and then they shoot them into outer space, where they quickly cooled. That's perfect for the hydroplate theory. They can't explain it at all. High temperatures, high velocity collisions, quickly cooled, it's perfect. And then the inland seas, what's happening there when the granite's fluttering, it's making radioactivity, and so that's going to make weaknesses in the granite, and it's just going to explode out of there. Boom. And so a lot of that stuff just kept on going, and that's where we get our asteroids and our comets. And he accurately predicted what's in an asteroid. You're going to find stuff from Earth there, and NASA with their billions of dollars was wrong. And so now we'll replay this for you, and notice how she's going to point to the mid-oceanic ridge, and now you're going to understand why Doug is so excited.
So let me know what you think.
This is the most insane space news in a really long time. This asteroid, called Bennu, is 63 million kilometers away. That's 160 times farther than the moon is. Over the last few years, this spacecraft called OSIRIS-REx traveled all the way there, touched its surface, grabbed a sample, and brought it all the way back to Earth. And what they found in that sample is insane. It's rich in carbon, nitrogen, and organic compounds, all of which are essential to life as we know it, but we've seen that before. The asteroid is also covered in a mineral called serpentine, which looks like this. And these samples look just like the type of rock that we find here in mid-ocean ridges. This is where the stuff from the mantle of the Earth comes up and touches the water. It's underwater. Scientists think that this asteroid could be a chunk of an ancient small ocean world.
So do you see why he was so excited? It fits the hydroplate theory perfectly and everything. Now they're finding amino acids on Mars and they think, oh, life started in Mars. It's like, no, the amino acid got shot up there during the hydroplate when that erupted. And it's like if you found some bricks and roofing and wiring and, rebar all in a jungle, that's sign of a disaster, right? That's not a building being put together. And that's what they're finding on Mars. This is something that it's pieces of the Earth. And so we'll wrap up here real quickly. Yeah, world of surprises in their comets. And also, wouldn't this leave a mark on the Earth, or on the moon? Yeah, that's why the near side of the moon is pounded. Okay, and then it also made predictions. You'd find large volumes of pooled water under the ocean, under the mountains, and it was right. There'd be crystalline rock under the Gibraltar and Bosporus and Dardanelles, and the Golden Gate Bridge would be found to be eroded into V-shaped notches. Published in 95 and confirmed in 98, 2009, and 2018. And then soil erosion on channels on Mars will be contained traces of Earth-like soluble compounds such as salt from the Earth's pre-flood subterranean chambers. And this was published in 2001 and it was confirmed in 2004. And then some comets, asteroids, and meteors will be found to be made of crystalline material forged in extreme heat. Predicted it in 2001 and confirmed in 2004 and 5. He's on the trail. He's got the right model. And I asked the plate tectonics guys, or catastrophic plate tectonics guys, I say, what accurate predictions have you had? What accurate predictions do you currently have? And he said, we don't make predictions. And I asked him, well, which biblical model, what Bible supports catastrophic plate tectonics? What Bible verses? He said Genesis 6, 7, and 8. Well, that's any flood model. What distinguishes yours? But that's all they had. Okay, and then asteroids are rock piles, often with internal ice acting as weak glue. And that's been confirmed. Most of the rocks, pebble-sized and larger, comprising asteroids and comets, will be found to be rounded to some degree. If you have things collide in space, it's going to have sharp edges. The only way you get rounded boulders is if they go through a fast flow of water breaking off the edges before they get shot up there. And then he said Planet X will not be found in the next 5 years by January of 2001 because it does not exist. Another confirmed one. Bones and other organic remains that contain enough carbon are believed to be older than 100,000 years will be shown to be relatively young. And that's been confirmed. And so you got these blind smokers. There's still supercritical water coming up in the Atlantic Ocean. And it's seen jetting up in the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. How did it get there? Well, God put it there, I think. So that's the hydroplate theory. The rupture phase, the flood phase, the continental drift phase. Rupture phase, that's Genesis 7:11. The fountains of the great deep broke up. The flood phase is that's the 150 days. The continental drift phase is on day 151. The mountains rise, and we're still recovering for it. And Dr. Thomas Chamberlain, he said you should always have or seek to have multiple working hypotheses. So as people can think critically, they can compare and contrast, they can think independently. Otherwise, you just memorize and conform. Well, sadly, that's what's happening in our government schools. They're giving a blind chance perspective of the past. And I think that we're going to just end it here. Thank you so much.